This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free lecture notes that go with this podcast, please visit opentuition.com.
Okay, we're going to look at question 2 from section B of the December 2014 paper F5 exam. So as always, I hope you've got it in front of you. Look at the requirements first of all. A, briefly explain why the senior stylist time has been described as the bottleneck activity, supporting your answer with calculations. Part B, calculate the throughput accounting ratio for cuts and for treatments, assuming the bottleneck activity is fully utilised. And so, really, the requirements first, as always, it does mean there's no doubt here as to what we're being tested on. It's throughput accounting as a topic. And I hope you've watched the lecture already. I mean, I can't repeat the whole lecture, but hopefully with this example, we can more or less sort out what's going on. However, part A wants us to explain this bottleneck activity. Remember, before we look at the detail, what we mean by the bottleneck, when there are several processes taking place, the bottleneck is the one that's slowing everything down, which is limiting how much we can do overall. Let's look at this question to make it clear what I mean. Glanco is a hairdressing salon, provides both cuts and treatments to clients. All cuts and treatments are carried out by one of the salon's 3 senior stylists. They also have 2 salon assistants and 2 junior stylists. Every customer attending the salon is first seen by an assistant who washes the hair, next by a senior stylist who cuts or treats. It's like 2 products here, but does the cutting or treating. And then finally, a junior stylist dries the hair. And we're told in that little table, for both cutting and treating, how long is spent by the assistant who's doing the washing, by the stylist who's doing the cutting or treating, and by the junior stylist who's drying. We're open 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. We're closed 2 weeks a year. The staff's salaries, 40,000 for senior, 28 for junior, 12 for assistant. Cleaning products for washing, 60 cents a client. Additional products during a treatment, 740. Other costs, excluding those mentioned, 106,400, and we're charging 60 for a cut, 110 for a treatment. And finally, the senior stylist time has been correctly identified as the bottleneck. And so we know the answer to part A. We know it's the senior stylist who is the bottleneck, but we've got to explain why. Why is it that that what's restricting how many clients we can see is the time being spent with the senior stylist? You see, there's going to be a limit. I'll do the numbers in a second, but you know, if we're working 10,000 hours a year, if you're having to spend an hour with a senior stylist, then the most people we can see is 10,000 people. Doesn't matter how many people the assistants could deal with. You know, we need work by the senior stylist. Now, it's very tempting to say straight away, look at cuts. The one that we spend most time with is senior stylist, an hour. The other 2 are much quicker. It's a senior stylist who's slowing us down. Similarly, treatment. 1.5 hours with senior stylist. Much less time with the assistant. So it's very tempting to say straight off, if you're spending most time with senior stylists, they're the bottleneck. If you had said that, you would get some credit, but certainly you wouldn't get all the marks. Because if you look back to the second sentence, or second and third sentence, we actually have 3 senior stylists. And we only have 2 salon assistants and 2 junior stylists. So if you've got more senior stylists, then perhaps it doesn't matter as much if it takes longer to have a cut with a senior stylist. And so we do need to do slightly more than just look at that table. First of all, how many hours are we actually open for? We're open 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. We closed for 2 weeks a year. Well, unless you're told differently, there are always 52 weeks in a year. If we close for 2 weeks, we're open for 50. And so in total, we're open for 2,400 hours over the year. And let's look and see, effectively repeating that table, but let's see how many customers an assistant would be capable of dealing with, a senior stylist capable of dealing with, and so on. But see what I mean? You see, as far as cutting is concerned, assistants, how many assistants have we got? We've got 2. Each one's going to be working for 2,400 hours. So there's 4,800 hours available. Each customer, we spend 0.1 of an hour. So how many customers would they be capable of dealing with? Well, in the 4,800 hours, they could deal with 48,000 customers. But the same customers who want cuts also have to have the senior stylist. And how many customers could they deal with? Well, with 3 of them, they're each working 2,400 hours. So there's 7,200 hours available. Each customer would have to spend 1 hour. So they could only deal with 7,200 customers. So the fact the assistants could deal with 48,000 is quite irrelevant, because they're not just going to wash people's hair and throw them out. You know, so far, we can only cope with 7,200 customers, because that's the number the senior stylist can cut. And as a result, that's all the assistants will deal with. To finish that bit of it off, though, what about junior stylists? Again, from the top, there are 2 of them. They're working 2,400 hours, so in total there's 4,800 hours of work available. Each customer takes half an hour, which means they could deal with 9,600 customers. Well, that's the maximum number of customers each of them could deal with. But given that anybody wanting a cut has to have all 3 services, it's the senior stylist who's restricting it. The most cuts we can do, and therefore the wash and dry that goes with it, is 7.2. Well, in exactly the same way, what about those who just want a treatment? The assistants, 2 at 2,400, each treatment takes 0.3 hours. So they could deal with 16,000 customers. The senior stylist, remember, there's 7,200 hours. It's 1.5 hours of treatment. So they could deal with 4,800 customers. And finally, the junior stylist, 2 of them. Drying takes half an hour, so that's before 9,600. Well, the most customers we can deal with is limited by, again, senior stylist. They could only deal with 4,800. The fact that assistant and junior stylist could deal with more is irrelevant, because, again, we don't wash people's hair unless they're having a treatment. Anyway. So that's why the senior stylist is a bottleneck. Now, I'm not going to write that down, what I just said, read what the examiner's written, but it is, I can't think of any better way of showing the calculations, and I think that's the way the examiner's shown it as well. But it is simply, but that's what's limiting how many customers we can deal with. Part B, well, thankfully, the question did actually tell us senior size was the bottleneck, because that is essential for doing the arithmetic in part B. And so even if you couldn't explain very well, at least we do know what our bottleneck is. And here it's very conventional with two effectively products, cuts and treatments. And remember, when we're doing throughput accounting, first of all, we look at the contribution per unit for each product. Here are products, it's a service, but same idea, cuts and treatments. But we make that one big assumption in throughput, that the only truly variable cost is materials, that all other costs, which in other contexts we think of as variable, that all other costs we regard in the short term as fixed. And so, effectively we look at contribution, but we take the sales revenue, for cuts is 60, for treatments 110. Subtract variable costs, but again, the only variable cost is materials. And the materials, the only materials mentioned here are the cost of cleansing the products when they're washed. And remember, they need a wash whether it's a cut or a treatment. There are additional products applied during a treatment of $7.40, presumably not if we have a cut. So those are the only material costs mentioned, and therefore contribution on this basis, which we call the throughput, for cuts is $59.40 per unit, and for treatments is a different figure, 110 minus 8, $102 a unit. So there's the throughput, and in a sense contribution per unit. For throughput accounting ratio, we need to look at the contribution to throughput per hour of bottleneck resource. So how many hours of bottleneck resource are there? Remember, the bottleneck resource of the senior stylist. So for cutting, it's 1 hour per unit. For treatment, it's 1.5 hours per unit. And therefore, the throughput per hour $59.40 over 1 is $59.40. 102 over 1.5 is 68. We're not there yet. The throughput accounting ratio itself is the throughput per hour, which we've just calculated, divided by the total costs per hour. And so all we need is the cost per hour, and then we've got the throughput accounting ratios. So what are the other costs? We exclude the materials, but the other costs, which we assume are fixed, we've got other salon costs, 106,400. That includes labour and raw materials. Well, raw materials, yes, we exclude. We're after the fixed costs. But we do have the cost of the labour, which is the stylists themselves. We've got these senior stylists, assistants and junior, and we talk what the wages are. So senior. Now here the wording is bad, and so the examiner, if you look at the answer, the examiner does allow it to be read either way. Certainly the way I read it, senior stylists are paid 40,000 a year. There are 3 of them, so in total, £120,000. Before I explain the alternative, just let me finish it. The junior stylists are paid 28,000, and there are 2 of them. And the assistants, there are 2 of them, and they're paid 12,000. So the total labour, 176, 180, 180, 200,000. Now that's what the examiner intended, and I must admit that's the way I read it. However, a lot of people read it differently, and if you look at her answer, she does say it was accepted. A lot of people read it as being the 40,000 for senior stylists being the total for all 3 of them, 28 for junior being the total for both of them, and so on. So if you read it that way, in total for senior it's 40, in total for junior it's 28, in total for assistants it's 12. Well, I've got 200 and I'm going to carry on with that figure, but if you'd got 80,000 instead, although your final answer will obviously be different, you would still have got full marks. It was a bit unfair in one sense. I mean, certainly for people in the UK, you know, the 12,000 for the assistant, it's perhaps more likely it was 12,000 each than 12,000 for 2, which is only 6,000 each. But I appreciate, you know, in other countries it may not be so obvious. Although, I'm not saying you'd spotted this in the exam, it wouldn't matter. But if you think about it, if it was 40,000 in total for the 3 stylists, that would mean they were each getting paid, what is it, 13,333. If it was 28,000 for the junior stylists, there are only 2 of them, they would be getting paid 14,000 each. Well, I thought that was a bit odd. You would expect, whatever country you're in, you'd expect senior to be paid more than junior, but still. Anyway, nothing to worry about. Either was accepted. However, it does mean on my figures the total is 306,400. And so the cost per bottleneck hour in total 306,400. How many bottleneck hours were there? I had worked it out somewhere. Senior stylists? No, I didn't, sorry. There are 3 senior stylists. They're working 2,400 hours a year each, so 7,200. So the cost per each hour of bottleneck is 42.56. I hope I've done my arithmetic right. And so finally, the throughput accounting ratio. Incidentally, don't be frightened of abbreviating the exam, but the throughput accounting ratio, cuts and treatments. I wrote earlier, it's the throughput per hour, 59.40 for cuts, 68 for treatments. divided by, in each case, the cost per bottleneck hour of here 42.56. And so finally, I think 1.40 to do some places for cuts, and 160 for treatments. There we are. Incidentally, I should have said at the beginning, although it doesn't matter abbreviating as I've done here, do try and be reasonably neat. I mean, you may not think I'm perfect, but that'd be neat enough for the exam. But do, because it's so easy, especially when you're rushing, to make a silly mistake somewhere. And of course, you make one silly mistake. If I'd have, I might sound stupid, but if I'd got 101 there instead of 102, then it makes everything that follows wrong. Well, you don't lose marks twice. That silly mistake might cost me half a mark. But provided I've done the right thing on my figure from then on, I'd get full marks for everything else, even though it was different than the answer. You don't keep losing marks. But that only works if the examiner can see what you're doing, the marker. If the marker can see what you're doing. You know, if you're just a whole load of figures everywhere, and you make that one silly mistake and your final answer's wrong, they can't give you many marks. The way I've set it out, it's perfectly clear at each stage what I'm doing. Again, if I'd added up wrong here and got the wrong figure, half a mark, that's all. Everything else I would have still got full marks for. So don't throw marks away. You know, make it easy for the marker, that it's clear you know what you're doing. If you're running out of time, you can still get some easy marks. You know, it's clear they want throughput accounting ratio. Fine. If all you've done is put that down, it's going to get you a mark. It's not going to pass you the question, but you know, every mark counts. Especially, obviously, if you otherwise would have ended up failing on 49.